Well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to begin just by saying how much I appreciate this opportunity to be a part of Celebrate Science Indiana and its virtual state this year. My name's Greg Smith. I'm the Senior Conservation Scientist here at the Indianapolis Museum of Art. And I'm joining you from my laboratory at the museum. We have a full analytical chemistry laboratory here that the purpose of which is to study and help in the preservation of the museum's collection. So my program for today is actually to talk about a type of imaging that we do in the laboratories to study artwork. And so this is imaging that uses infrared radiation instead of your normal visible light that you use in photography. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen that has a bit of a presentation, just a few slides to give you an idea of this technology and how we use it in the museum. And then we're going to segue into making your own infrared camera, a very cheap, inexpensive infrared camera that you can use to play around with and to do some experimenting at home or possibly even in an art museum. So I'm going to share my screen right now with that presentation. So you should be seeing my title screen, What Lies Beneath. And so that is the purpose of this particular technology, is we use it to look through paintings to see what is underneath the surface layer of paint. So to begin talking about this, I want to begin just by talking about the electromagnetic spectrum, because we live and interact with our world through what is a very narrow wedge of the radiation spectrum, the visible light that your eye is sensitive to. So you can see the full electromagnetic spectrum running from gamma rays. These are the very short wavelengths, the very high energy radiation, for instance, coming from the sun. And then on the opposite end, you have microwaves and the short wavelengths, the very low energy radiation. And then right here in this middle, the short section between 400 nanometers and about 750 nanometers, this is that little sliver of radiation that your eye is sensitive to and dictates the world that we live in, color vision and visible light. But what I'm going to be talking about today are actually the wavelengths of light that are just below the red region of the spectrum, and it's called the infrared region. Your eye can't sense them, but they're all around us. So in the field of conservation or cultural heritage chemistry, we use the full electromagnetic spectrum. And so at the top of my slide, you can see all these different types of imaging that we do in the laboratory, and each one will give us a slightly different view of the artwork that will tell us something about its craftsmanship, its condition, whether it's been damaged or not, and sometimes about its authenticity. And so we're going to be talking, as I mentioned today, about this imaging that we call infrared reflectography or infrared imaging. So when you move outside of the visible realm, things start to look very alien. And so I have on the screen two pictures of me that I took several years ago with my webcam. One of them is visible light. This is the sort of visible radiation that is typical of color photography that you know all about. And then the other image is using near infrared wavelengths of radiation. And as you can see, I look quite different in the near infrared. So for instance, my hair is a brown color, but in the infrared, it turns this frosty white because now it's not absorbing any light and therefore it doesn't have color. The whites of my eyes, as you can see, they turn jet black in the near infrared, and that's because they're strongly absorbing in the near infrared. So to explain this, I'm going to have to delve into an area that we call spectroscopy, or the study of how light interacts with matter. And so I ran some little experiments that I'm going to talk you through. And what I did was I took two blue paints. One of the paints is ultramarine. It's a very nice bright blue color. And the other paint is Prussian blue. It's a very deep dark blue color. And I painted them out on a piece of white paper, nice reflective white paper. And then I did spectroscopy on them. So the spectrum I'm showing down here in the white blocks, it runs from blue light at 400 nanometers through red light at 750 nanometers, and then all the way out to 1,000 nanometers. This is well into the infrared region. So both of these paints appear blue because they reflect the blue wavelengths of light and they absorb the red wavelengths of light. So that's why they look blue to your eye. But if we trace them out further into this near infrared region, you can see that they behave very, very differently. So for instance, the ultramarine blue becomes highly transparent and reflective, whereas the Prussian blue continues to absorb light all throughout the infrared. And as a result, you can see through ultramarine paint, and Prussian blue paint will block all the infrared. So I'm going to start by just talking about what a painting is, because it may not be apparent to everyone that a painting is actually a multi-layered sample. So it normally starts with something like a piece of canvas. This is your support. And the artist will typically paint a layer of reflective white paint on there. This is called the ground layer. And then on top of that, they'll take something like a pencil, graphite pencil, or a piece of charcoal, and they'll sketch out what they want to paint. So this is their cartoon or their sketch. And once they've done that, they'll go over top of it with the paints that they're using. So I'm using two paints here. We talked about the ultramarine paint and the Prussian blue paint. And then finally, they'll put a layer of clear varnish on top. And this is what makes the painting saturated and kind of glossy on its surface. So if we then take our painting, which I show over here with the two different colors of paint, and we do spectroscopy on it, we can understand how this camera image is generated. So the ground layer, this white layer that is reflective, is often a pigment called lead white. And you can see that it transmits and reflects light all the way across the spectrum, from the blue down here all the way out to the near infrared. But the sketch, which is made out of carbon, is the exact opposite. It absorbs all wavelengths of light, including the infrared region. We've already looked at how our paints perform. So if we're sitting here in the near infrared and we shine this beam of light at our painting, the light is going to go through the ultramarine and it's going to be absorbed by our sketch. But in areas where there is no sketch, it's going to go through the ultramarine and bounce back off. So here's my little sample that I was talking about. You can see the white ground. You can see the ultramarine blue paint. It's painted very thinly on the surface. And you can see my sketch. It's just a bunch of black lines. But this is a visible image where you see the blue color. In the near infrared, that blue paint disappears and we can see the drawing very easily. Prussian blue, it's entirely different. It looks dark in the visible, and because it absorbs also all of our near infrared, it also looks dark in the near infrared. So this explains how we're going to generate an image looking through certain paint layers. So how do we actually do this experiment? Well, we have some sort of artwork. You probably recognize this guy. It's Vincent van Gogh. This is a self-portrait, for example. And we're going to need some sort of source of infrared radiation. Now, I've listed this as an incandescent lamp, and it's important that it be incandescent. These are those old light bulbs that got really hot, and they got really hot because they were pretty poor light bulbs. They were really good infrared light bulbs, which your eye can't see, so that's why they got so hot. You need some sort of incandescent light bulb because our modern light bulbs, like LEDs, they don't have any infrared radiation. They just have visible radiation. So we're going to be using an old style light bulb for this experiment. We're going to point it at our painting and the light is going to reflect off the surface. We have a filter that is going to block all the visible light, but will transmit the infrared radiation. And we have a camera that's going to record the picture in the infrared. So how do we use this in the art museum? Well, I have a lot of examples to show you of some neat tricks that we do to study the artwork. Some of these come from the museum here at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and some are examples from when I was a professor at Buffalo State College. So this is an example of an oil painting on a piece of wood, on a piece of panel, and you probably can recognize this is Jesus down here and Mary, and there are some angels on either side. And so this painting is being shown right now in visible light, but if we turn on the infrared camera, this is what we see. We're actually looking right through that paint layer, and what we see instead is the sketch or the drawing that the artist was using to plan out this composition before they ever started painting. They wanted to know where everything ought to be before they started putting the paint on. So you're actually looking at the sort of graphite pencil sketch that the artist put down on the ground layer. This is another example of one of those oil paintings that actually is part of the IMA's collection. This is by Scarsellino, and he was painting back in the 1500s. And so in this painting, again, you see Mary, you see baby Jesus, and you see John the Baptist right here. This is the visible image. And then this is the image with the infrared camera. And again, you're looking through the paint layer and you're seeing all the drawing or sketching that the artist did. And this sketch, as you can see, is very different from the Pietà painting that we looked at earlier. This is very sharp, fine lines, whereas this is very brushy lines. And sometimes the way the artist prepares the canvas actually tells us who the artist was. So this is a bit of evidence or a clue that we can use to identify artists, even if there's no signature on the artwork. Now, the other thing that we see in this picture that's interesting is that the artist changed his mind. And the reason we know that is if you look at the painting, baby Jesus is sitting on Mary's lap and his feet are stretched out down Mary's lap. But in the drawing, you can see that he was originally drawn with his legs coming across Mary's lap. So he was riding side saddle instead of full on in her lap. You'll also notice that both of his hands are reaching over to grab what's in John the Baptist's hands. But in the final painting, the artist changed that, and instead, the Christ child is making the sign of the benediction with his hand. So we can also use this technique to study the way the artist works and changes their composition as they think it out in their head and begin applying the paints. Oop. So this is an example that comes from the Memorial Art Gallery in New York, and it's an example of a banquet. You can see the table here, and I'm showing a close-up of the gold plate, which is empty. So what kind of banquet doesn't have any food? But if you look in the infrared image, you can see that originally the plate had all these chicken bones on it and chicken legs. And so for some reason, the artist painted that out in the final version. And artists will sometimes do that. This is an example of a painting that comes from the Swope Art Gallery that came to the museum several years ago. And it's by John Rogers Cox. It's this very sad, forlorn scene. You can see this little house is sitting off in the distance, these barren fields with a plow here in the foreground. And when we look closely down here in the corner, you can see John Rogers Cox has signed the painting, and he dated it 1943, but then he came back later and he dated it 1946. So what's going on? Why are there two dates on this painting? Well, if you look with your infrared camera and you focus on this little house, what you see is that actually there was a second little house or a little barn off behind it. And there's a good chance 3 years later in 1946, the artist painted out this, leaving just the house in the distance, which to me personally looks a lot sadder, a lot more forlorn out there all by itself. But this is an example of an artist making a change to their painting several years after they finished it. We can see how artists work. For instance, do they make grid lines across their canvas to help keep everything in proportion? Sometimes we can see that artists change their composition entirely, or maybe they used an old canvas and simply painted over top of it. Here's an example of another oil painting in the visible, And then with the infrared camera, hopefully you can see this ghostly figure peering out from behind. And in fact, he looks a lot like Martin Luther. A very famous example of this is Pablo Picasso, who painted over his canvases a lot of the time. This is an example of a painting from the Art Institute of Chicago. You can see it's a blue period painting, that important period in Picasso's life. But with the infrared image, you can see that in fact there was a different composition that had a woman here in the background, you can see, that was overpainted later by Picasso. And finally, I have an example here of how we can document materials that are used in artwork. This is an example of samurai armor. It certainly looks like it's just this dark piece of armor here, but with the infrared camera, it highlights that in fact, it's a lot of different materials all woven together to make this armor that is not entirely visible to your eye. This is a great example of a hidden inscription. So this is actually the back of an artwork. You can see this piece of wood. That's what the canvas is stretched around. And it looks like something has been smudged out here. There's this big black mark running across the wooden stretcher. And when we image this with infrared wavelengths, you can see that the artist actually wrote in cursive, double page, weekly. And this went in a magazine. This was actually a painting that was a sketch that was going to be reproduced in a 2-page spread in a magazine called The Weekly. Forensic scientists will also use this technique to study examples of documents that might have been altered or messed with. So I've just made up this example using an old check from an old bank account. This is written out to John Doe, and you can see it's a big check. It's worth $100,000, but this is visible light. If we turn on the infrared camera, you can see that someone's actually messed with this check. It was written out to John Doe originally for $100 using a different type of pen, and then someone came in and added the extra zeros and the word thousand to make this check worth a lot more. And so a forensic scientist may use this to study whether a document has been altered or changed. Well, these cameras that I keep talking about, what are these pieces of technology? Well, at the museum, we have a very fancy infrared camera. It's called an indium gallium arsenide linear scanning back system, and it's a very expensive infrared camera, about an $80,000 system, but it gives us amazing images, high resolution images of artwork. But I'm going to talk to you about some simple ways that you can get a similar sort of imaging using things like cheap point and shoot cameras or digital SLR cameras, which can also be made to be infrared cameras. Now, I'll warn you, you don't get quite the same quality of image. This is an example of a little Madonna and Child painting that's part of our collection. On the left-hand side, I'm showing one of these inexpensive camera images. This is based off of just a point and shoot camera compared to our expensive scanning back camera that you see over here. So for instance, in Jesus's hair, we can't really see the drawing that the artist used to make all the curls for Jesus's hair, but with our expensive camera, they suddenly become visible. So you're not going to get super images, but I think you'll get some fun images and some great examples that you can play with and experiment with at your house. So I'm going to stop sharing and go back to my camera. So hopefully you can see behind me this picture of a cat. So what's on the screen right now is an example of an image from a little camera, a little night vision web camera, which we'll get to in just a second. But I want to point out that you can also take old point and shoot cameras like this old Kodak camera. This is really old. It's back when 3 megapixel camera was a super camera, super high resolution camera. Because all of these digital cameras are also infrared cameras. The reason you can't use them as they come off the shelf is that the sensor, which is sensitive to the infrared, the company will actually put a tiny little filter in there. So I'm holding this filter right now on the tip of this clamp, and this filter is put inside the camera and it blocks all the infrared. Now, the company doesn't want it to sense infrared, because if they did, all of your photographs would be red tinged. They would be sort of a maroon color. So they block the infrared intentionally. But you can crack these open and carefully remove that filter, and now it becomes an infrared camera once again. Now, if you want something even higher resolution, this is an example of a DSLR point and shoot type camera that has been modified to be an infrared camera. Again, we simply pull out the little filter inside the camera, and importantly, we're adding a filter to the front of the camera. This filter will block all the visible light, not the infrared, so that now the camera can only take pictures in the infrared and you don't see any visible in your images. So that's going to be our strategy for making an infrared camera. Well, to get even cheaper, what I'm going to be showing you is a little camera like this. This is a night vision web camera that you can buy on Amazon or eBay for just a few bucks. In fact, when I bought this, it was $6. Now, it has to be a night vision web camera. And you'll know that it's a night vision web camera because it'll have these little infrared LEDs. So the idea here is that the camera is sensitive to visible light, so you can use it with the lights on. But if you turn your lights off, these little infrared LEDs turn on, and the camera now will sense infrared light, and you'll still be able to see yourself with the night vision web camera. So what do? Well, we will take the lens cap. So this lens cap came with the camera. It just goes right onto the tip of it. And I pulled this lens cap off and I cut the center out of it. And instead, I bought a little piece of infrared transparent visible blocking filter material. And I have all of these written down on a PDF that you can download from the Celebrate Science Indiana webpage, which tell you exactly how to buy one of these little sheets of film. It's about $6 for the camera, maybe $12 or $16 for the sheet of film. But as you can see, we're going to be able to make a whole lot of cameras out of this one